At 3 in the morning on November 8th, 1875, a ship called the Oliver Wolcott was picking its way through the night off the coast of Washington Territory. She was a revenue cutter, a small armed government patrol ship, part of the Customs Service that would one day become the United States Coast Guard. And one of her crew spotted something low in the water. It was a piece of a ship. Specifically, it was a section of a pilot house roof, and lashed to it was a 21-year-old sailor named Neil Henley, who had been floating in the November Pacific for 78 hours. He was alive. He had spent 3 nights in frigid water, watching his fellow shipmates die one at a time, and when the Wolcott's crew pulled him aboard, he became the second survivor of the steamship Pacific. There would never be a third. Two survivors, out of roughly 300 people. A ship that went down maybe 25 miles off the American coast, on a busy shipping lane, within sight of other vessels' lights. It was the deadliest disaster the west coast of North America had ever seen, and it would stay the deadliest for decades, and she took a fortune down with her. A Wells Fargo strongbox and the gold of an entire mining season. A treasure that could be worth as much as $10 million today. It sat on the seafloor for 147 years, until searchers finally proved where the Pacific was, and a federal judge had to decide who owns gold that's been at the bottom of the ocean since 1875. This is the story of the SS Pacific, how she sank, why only 2 people survived her, and how $10 million in gold was very nearly lost to the seafloor forever. Quick note before we begin. This is a long story, and if you like interesting history told in this style, with cited sources, subscribing is free, and it tells me to keep making these. Alright, Victoria, British Columbia, November 1875. To understand who was on that ship, you need to understand what Victoria was that fall. British Columbia had gold country up north, the Cassiar district, close to the Alaska line, and every spring, miners went up, and every November, the ones who'd done well came down with the season's earnings in gold dust and bank drafts, looking for a warm place to spend the winter. That warm place was San Francisco. The California gold rush of 1849 had turned it from a small port town into the metropolis of the entire Pacific coast, the place where Western gold became actual money, and where a miner with a heavy belt could spend a winter in comfort. Every strike that followed anywhere on the coast orbited it, the Fraser River, the Caribou, and now the Cassiar. You dug in the north, and you spent in the south. Victoria was the funnel. Everything and everyone heading south went by steamer, and in the first week of November, the docks were full of men with heavy pockets trying to catch the last comfortable boat of the year. The boat on offer that week was the Pacific, and here the story starts to turn. The Pacific was 25 years old, which for a wooden steamship worked hard in salt water was old age. She was a wooden sidewheel steamer, 223 feet long, 33 feet across the beam, about 876 tons. Built in New York in 1850 to feed the California boom, and quick in her day, on her maiden run, she broke the speed record down the East Coast. She spent her youth on the gold rush's ocean highway between San Francisco and Panama, which was how people and gold moved between California and the East before the railroad, and by the 1860s, she was already worn out. In 1861, she ran aground in the Columbia River and sank. They raised her, patched her up, and eventually set her aside as surplus, a retired ship headed for the breakers. What saved her was a new gold rush. In the early 1870s, prospectors struck gold in the Cassiar country, the same district those Victoria miners were coming down from, and the rush that followed packed the coast with passengers. Fares were cheap because the steamship lines were fighting price wars, and a company called Goodall, Nelson and Perkins needed hulls, so the Pacific came out of retirement, born in one gold rush, exhumed by another. She was refitted, cosmetically at least. Witnesses would later say her timbers were so rotten in places you could pull fastenings out of them by hand, but she had a fresh coat of paint, a respectable name, and a schedule to keep. Her captain was 34 years old, and his name was Jefferson Davis Howell. His older sister Verena had married a Mississippi senator named Jefferson Davis back in 1845, which is how the captain got his name, and in time, the strangest possible brother-in-law, the once and only president of the Confederacy. Howell had served in the Confederate Navy as a teenager, gone west after the war like a lot of men with unusable resumes, and worked his way up the coastal steamship trade. People genuinely liked him. He was sociable, generous, good company at the table. Now it makes sense to blame the captain in a disaster like this one, and there have even been claims that Howell took command drunk. But the record is better than the reputation. He'd trained at Annapolis before the war. The Pacific wasn't his first command. He'd been master of coastal steamers called the Idaho, the Montana, and the Pelican. And only months before this voyage, when the steamer Los Angeles broke her shaft and stranded, Howell's conduct was singled out for bravery. As for the drunk story, Henry Jelly, one of the two survivors, a man with every reason to bury this captain, went out of his way to kill it, stating publicly that Howell was on the bridge when the lines were cast off and steered her out of Victoria Harbor with his own hands. What the record actually holds against him is stranger than incompetence. The day before, in Tacoma, this mail steamer sat at her dock for hours with steam up and passengers waiting because the captain had gone to bed with a headache and left orders that he was not to be disturbed. The Victoria departure ran late too, by half an hour or more. A newspaperman named D.W. Higgins, who stood on that wharf saying goodbye to friends he would never see again, spent the rest of his life arguing that the lost time is precisely what put the Pacific on a collision course with a ship she'd otherwise never have met. And whatever his record said, nobody pressing a cheap ticket into his purser's hand that morning was asking about it. The passengers came aboard in Victoria on the morning of November 4th. And here's a detail that tells you everything about the era. Nobody knows exactly how many of them there were. The official count ran to roughly 275 people, including the crew, but the manifest was a mess. Steerage passengers half recorded, children traveling free and uncounted. Credible estimates run past 300. For scale, the Pacific was licensed to carry 203 passengers, and her 5 lifeboats had rated space for 160 people. Nobody counted because nobody had to. Among them were Cassiar miners with their gold, a theater troupe, families with kids heading to California for the winter, and Sewell Moody, Sue Moody, the lumber baron whose sawmill settlement on Burrard Inlet, Moodyville, would eventually be absorbed into a city you know as Vancouver. He was one of the most important businessmen on that coast, and he almost missed the boat. He'd planned to take a later steamer, changed his plans, and walked up the gangway of the Pacific. In the hold, along with the coal and the freight, was a Wells Fargo strongbox holding $79,200. Call it around $2.3 million in today's money. And that box deserves 30 seconds of its own, because a Wells Fargo treasure box is one of the great objects of the American West. Since 1862, nearly every one of them had come out of a single San Francisco workshop, where a Maine-born carpenter named Joseph Ayer built them from heavy pine and oak, reinforced the lid and corners with iron, painted them forest green, and lettered Wells Fargo and Company across the front in white. Fully loaded with gold dust, bars, and coin, a box could weigh 150 pounds. About the most a grown man could hoist onto his shoulder, which was exactly the point. On the stage roads, these boxes rode under the driver's feet, guarded by a hired man with a sawed-off shotgun in the seat beside him, the shotgun messenger, the job that gave us the phrase riding shotgun, and they were the favorite target of every road agent in the West. In fact, that very summer, in the Sierra foothills, a polite highwayman with a flour sack over his head had just begun a long career of emptying Wells Fargo boxes. The newspapers would come to know him as Black Bart. This particular box traveled by sea instead, and it did not travel alone. Wells Fargo's agent in Victoria, a private banker named Francis Goresh, walked up the gangplank specifically to escort it home to San Francisco. On the passengers themselves, in money belts, in carpet bags, sewn into coats, was the Cassiar season's take, commonly put at another $100,000 or more. Add it all up, the strongbox, the bank shipments, the miners' pokes, and the gold aboard the Pacific could be worth as much as $10 million today. The Pacific cast off at 9:30 that morning, and she left Victoria with a list. She was leaning noticeably to one side, badly loaded, badly trimmed, too full, and the crew fixed it in the accepted style of the day with a method that, well, would come back to bite them. They filled the lifeboats with water. 2 of the ship's 5 lifeboats, both hanging on the port side, boats that existed to save the people on board, were pumped full of seawater where they hung in the davits, as ballast, to lever the ship back toward level. It worked. The list eased. The Pacific steamed out into the Strait of Juan de Fuca, looking like a proper ship, and she carried her safety equipment south as dead weight, filled to the brim with the same ocean it was meant to keep people out of. Nobody aboard seems to have objected. It was, by the standards of the coastal trade in 1875, normal. That same night, a second ship was working the same waters. The Orpheus was a big square-rigged sailing vessel headed north, running empty toward Nanaimo to take on coal. Her captain was Charles Sawyer, an experienced man having a bad week. He was short-handed, and he was navigating the approach to Cape Flattery, where the traffic from Victoria and Puget Sound funnels into the open Pacific. It was around 10 at night. Overcast, dark, a moderate sea. The Pacific was southbound under steam. The Orpheus was northbound under sail. Their courses crossed about 25 miles southwest of the Cape. What exactly happened in the next few minutes was argued about under oath for weeks afterward, and the honest version is this. Sawyer saw a light, misjudged it, and put the Orpheus across the steamer's bow. The coroner's jury said so. The Pacific's side of it is harder to defend because here is the entire watch that was running a steamer with some 300 people aboard at 10 o'clock that night. An inexperienced third mate, an inexperienced helmsman, and one lookout. Captain Howell had gone to his cabin. She was also steaming without her red and green side lights, the lights that tell another vessel which way you're crossing, showing nothing but the white light at her masthead. Sawyer insisted for the rest of his life that a proper watch on that steamer would have kept everyone alive, and even the American inquiry that wanted to blame him admitted it could not explain why the Pacific never turned and never stopped. The two ships came together at an angle, a glancing blow, not a head-on strike. Aboard the Orpheus, it felt like a scrape. Some rigging came down, timber cracked, and the crews shouted at each other across the dark. And right here, the record hands us the strangest small scene of the whole night. Captain Sawyer's wife, Lillian, was traveling with him, and she had come up on deck in time to stand beside her husband and witness the collision. Sawyer hailed the steamer and called on her to stand by. He got no answer at all, and Lillian, outraged by every account at the whole business, decided she was going to board the offending vessel herself over the rail, presumably to locate whoever was in charge and explain her feelings to him. Her husband had to physically restrain her, so the captain's wife on the Orpheus considered the collision minor enough and the two hulls close enough that climbing aboard the Pacific in protest seemed like a reasonable next step. Within about 20 minutes, nearly everyone on the ship she tried to board was in the water. When a collision is soft enough that boarding the other vessel to complain is physically an option, the ship that sinks from it was already a wreck waiting for a reason. Then the ships drifted apart. And here, the two stories split. As the ships drifted apart, so did the last hope of the roughly 300 souls aboard the Pacific. Aboard the Orpheus, Captain Sawyer looked at his own damage, judged his own ship to be in danger, and gave his attention to her. It's hard to fault him. He had hailed the steamer and gotten silence back. He never saw distress signals, never understood the steamer to be sinking, and expected she'd continue on her way. And remember who was aboard his ship? Lillian on the deck beside him, and somewhere below, their 4-year-old daughter, Isabel. A man who believes his ship is sinking, with his wife and small child aboard, tends his own ship. The Orpheus put her bow north and sailed on into the dark. Aboard the Pacific, the glancing blow had badly breached the old ship's hull. Rotten timber that had been patched and painted past 4 owners took the impact at exactly the wrong place, and the sea came in fast. She began to settle immediately, and everything that happened next happened in about 20 minutes. 300 people, give or take, went for boats that could not help them. Some of the boats were rotten. Some had no plugs, no oars, no working tackle. And some, remember the morning, were already full of seawater, hanging in their davits as ballast, impossible to launch by desperate people in the dark. One boat that did get away capsized almost instantly, overloaded and half swamped from the start. There had been no drill. Much of the crew the Inquest heard was no more prepared than the passengers. The deck lights failed as the water reached the engine room, and the rest happened in darkness. The ship broke apart, the funnel and the masts came down, and the cold did as the cold does. The water off Cape Flattery in November runs around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 Celsius. That may not sound deadly, but water strips heat from a human body roughly 25 times faster than air. A person immersed in it has, at best, a few hours. Neil Henley, the young quartermaster from the cold open, came up out of the water and found a section of the pilot house roof. Over the next hours, other people found it too. At one point, there were 8 of them on that raft, and one of them was Captain Jefferson Davis Howell. Through the night, the sea took them off one by one, swept away, or simply gone quiet with cold. The captain lasted until morning, Henley said afterward, and then he didn't. By the second day, Henley was alone. Somewhere else in the wreckage, a 22-year-old passenger named Henry Jelly had reached floating debris of his own. 2 days after the collision, on the morning of November 6th, a passing bark called the Messenger spotted him and brought him in. Frostbitten, barely conscious, and alive. He was the first survivor. Henley, on his roof, floated on. It would be another 2 days, 78 hours in total, before the Wolcott's lantern found him. 2 men, the only survivors out of roughly 300 people. Now back to the Orpheus, the other ship in the collision. Only 2 days later, she ran onto the rocks of Zardes Island in Barkley Sound, on the west coast of Vancouver Island. and was destroyed. Every one of her crew survived. People at the time found that sequence suspicious enough that Sawyer was hauled into federal court in San Francisco that January, accused of deliberately casting his own ship away to destroy the evidence. The case fell apart in 3 days. His defense was simple. The lighthouse at Cape Beale was so new it wasn't on his charts. He mistook it for the Cape Flattery light, and he steered for what he believed was the entrance to the strait. The captain of the Messenger, the very ship that had rescued Henry Jelly, backed him up in writing, saying he'd nearly made the identical mistake himself a few weeks earlier. So take the insurance story as what it is, an accusation from a grieving coast that a court looked at and let go. What's simply true is this: the ship that sank the Pacific followed her onto the bottom within 48 hours without costing a single life. Word reached Victoria on November 8th, and to understand what it did to that town, hold the numbers side by side. Victoria was a city of a few thousand people. The Pacific carried roughly 300, most of whom had boarded right there at the inner harbor 4 days earlier. Contemporary accounts say what you'd expect them to say, that virtually everyone in town knew someone on that ship. Businesses shuttered, flags came down to half-mast and stayed there, and for weeks afterward the tide kept delivering the proof. Wreckage, cargo, and bodies, drifting back in through the Strait of Juan de Fuca to the shorelines of the people who'd waved the ship off. Victoria still tells the story of one piece of that wreckage, a plank that came ashore carrying the name of S.P. Moody, Sue Moody, the lumber baron who changed his travel plans. It was part of a stateroom stanchion, and on its white paint in faint pencil, in a steady hand, someone had written 2 words under the name, "All Lost." You can weigh that one yourself too. The plank survives in a Vancouver museum collection, and I'll leave its provenance to the description. Some artifacts are true the way documents are true, and some are true the way grief is true. The coroner's jury sat in late November and split the blame with unusual honesty. The collision, they found, was the Orpheus's fault. She crossed the steamer's bow. But the dying was the Pacific's fault. They went further with Sawyer. The jury declared him guilty of manslaughter for sailing away without learning what his ship had hit, which sounds like consequences finally arriving, except that Sawyer stayed on the American side of the border, beyond the reach of a Canadian verdict, and nobody ever prosecuted it. As for the steamer, the jury censured her officers and crew as negligent and incompetent, and the testimony built the indictment plank by plank. The rotten boats, the absent drills, the overloading, the phantom manifest, and the lifeboats full of ballast water hanging over a sinking ship. None of it had broken any law that mattered. That was the point. In 1875 on that coast, a 25-year-old ship with waterlogged lifeboats and 300 uncounted souls was just a Tuesday departure. There was one more official proceeding, and it's the most damning of the 3. The United States Steamboat Inspection Service, the agency that had certified the Pacific as seaworthy, held its own court of inquiry in San Francisco, in secret. Presiding was the district's inspector of hulls, the very official whose signature had passed the Pacific's rotten hull months earlier. His name was Robert Waterman, and if you know your age of sail, you know him by his other name, Bully Waterman. Once the most infamous captain in America, whose voyage on the Clipper Challenge in 1851, dead and brutalized sailors, a mob waiting for him on the San Francisco docks, produced the first 21 criminal cases ever heard by the federal court in Northern California. He walked away from all of it, and the port of San Francisco later made him the man who decides which ships are safe. His inquiry into the Pacific concluded, brace yourself, that the Orpheus caused the collision, that Captain Sawyer was the villain of the piece, and that the inspection service had done nothing wrong at all, since in the inspector's judgment the ship would probably have sunk whether she was old or new. The San Francisco papers read the report and called it what it was, an agency grading its own homework in the dark. Here's where a story like this is supposed to turn into progress. Titanic gets lifeboat laws and an ice patrol. The Eastland changes naval architecture. The Pacific got nothing, more or less. No landmark legislation, no reform movement with her name on it. The steamship lines kept running old hulls, the price wars kept the boats full, and the coast simply absorbed the loss. The Pacific's owners renamed themselves the Pacific Coast Steamship Company 2 years later, and kept running cheap old ships into the next century, and one of them, George Perkins, went on to become governor of California, and then a United States senator for more than 20 years. The deadliest maritime disaster in the history of the West Coast produced 2 survivors, 1 damning inquest, and no consequences. If you're enjoying this video so far, please hit the like button. It helps me figure out what kind of videos you'd like to see, and it helps me improve. Now, the gold and the 147 years it spent on the bottom. By the way, why isn't this story better known? The Atlantic has Titanic, Lusitania, Andrea Doria, household names. The Pacific Coast's worst disaster gets, at best, a local historical marker's worth of attention. Part of it is timing. 1875 sits in the dead zone of memory, too late for frontier legend, too early for film and radio, and 37 years later Titanic arrived and permanently defined what a shipwreck story is supposed to look like. Rich men in evening dress, a band playing, an ocean liner. The Pacific had miners, mill hands, and a colonial port town on the far edge of the map. Part of it is geography. Victoria and the Northwest carried the grief, and the Northwest was a long way from the newspapers that decide what the country remembers. And part of it is that memory follows attention, and attention follows money. Nobody with resources had a reason to keep the Pacific's name alive. The families had no wreck, no graves, no lawsuit worth bringing. The gold on board belonged to dead men and a bonding company. The ocean had her, the ledger closed, and the world moved on. The wreck itself was never mysterious in the way of ships that vanish without witnesses. She went down on a known route, on a known night. She was simply, genuinely hard to get to. The Pacific lies somewhere between 1,000 and 1,600 feet down, on the slope where the seafloor falls away toward the open ocean. No diver has ever touched her, and no diver ever will. That is robot submarine depth. For her first 100 years on the bottom, the technology to search that deep did not exist at any price. From the 1970s on, side-scan sonar and remotely operated vehicles made her reachable for anyone willing to comb hundreds of square miles of seafloor for a rotten wooden ship on private money with no guarantee the gold could ever be pulled from the wreckage. For 50 years, everyone who ran those numbers walked away, but $10 million is a patient argument, and it was waiting for the one person who had never been able to walk away. Enter Jeff Hummel, who was a high school kid in the Seattle area when the Pacific first got into his head, and who never really got it out. This is the part of the story where obsession does what institutions wouldn't. Hummel spent years pulling the thread. Old charts, Inquest records, drift calculations from where the wreckage and the two survivors were recovered, trying to reverse engineer a single night in 1875 into a search box on a modern chart. He teamed up with Matt McCauley, another wreck hunter with the same disease, and together they built a company around the hunt, Rockfish Incorporated, working alongside a nonprofit called the Northwest Shipwreck Alliance. Between 2017 and 2022, they ran 12 expeditions. 12. Sonar passes, dead ends, gear failures, funding gaps, a decade-scale engineering project run on conviction. In 2022, the search box finally gave them back an anomaly that behaved like a wooden sidewheel steamer, and the follow-up dives brought back hull remains, fire brick from her furnaces, and coal from her bunkers, fingerprints strong enough for a federal court to treat the site as the Pacific, resting in deep water off the Washington coast, where she had lain for 147 years. And then, because this is America, the ghost ship went to court. Under Admiralty law, finding a wreck doesn't make it yours. A federal court has to sort out salvage rights, and old ships come with old paper. In November of 2022, Judge James Robart of the Western District of Washington granted Rockfish exclusive salvage rights over the site, with real conditions: a formal salvage plan, artifact reporting, status reports to the court every 90 days. The case name alone is worth the price of admission. Rockfish Incorporated versus unidentified wrecked and abandoned vessel. Then a claimant surfaced holding the legacy interests of the ship's insurers, the corporate descendants of the companies that had paid out on the Pacific's cargo in the 1870s, and thereby bought a claim on whatever she carried. A 150-year-old insurance payout coming back up with the wreck. The parties settled in late 2023, and the terms eventually surfaced in the court record. If gold is ever recovered and sold, Rockfish keeps about 98.5% of the net proceeds, and the insurance interests take the sliver that's left. The insurers later tried to unwind the deal. In February of 2025, Judge Robart said no. That June, the court extended Rockfish's exclusive salvage rights through January of 2027, put a trial on the calendar for the same month, and attached a warning: show tangible progress or don't count on another extension. So right now, as in currently this year, there is a salvage operation working the bones of a ship that sank when Ulysses S. Grant was president, run from vessels with satellite internet, filing status reports with a federal court, chasing a Wells Fargo strongbox and the pocket gold of Cassiar miners, and here is the honest status of the treasure. As I record this, not 1 ounce of gold has come up. What the salvers have recovered so far is fire brick, wood, and coal, while they rig equipment to hunt beneath the sediment for the one metal down there that doesn't rust. The gold went down with the ship, and nothing in 150 years has brought it back up. Whether Rockfish reaches it before their window closes in January of 2027, that's being decided out on the water right now. Which brings us back to the gold. The Pacific was beyond anyone's reach for her first century. That part, the sea gets to keep. But the tools to find her existed for 50 years before anyone seriously looked, and for 50 years the search never penciled out. 300 dead and the worst the West Coast ever suffered couldn't make those numbers work. You know what finally did? The strongbox. I don't say that to be bleak about it, because the ending cuts the other way too. The money reopened the case, but the case brought everything else up with it. The inquest record, the survivor's testimony, Sewell Moody's plank, Neil Henley's 78 hours, the water and the lifeboats, all of it back in the light in newspapers and courtrooms, and well, here, 150 years after Victoria's worst week. The gold is still down there, somewhere under the sediment. The story surfaced first. The ocean never actually hides anything, it turns out. It just waits for us to have a reason to look. If you made it this far, you're exactly who this channel is for. Subscribe if you haven't. Thanks for listening.